In the small Montana town of Pine Ridge, winter pressed its white fist against every window, turning breath to fog and roads to memory. Martin Carter, now 67 and retired, had come to cherish the hush that settled over his cabin at the edge of town each time snow swept in. He'd spent decades hauling freight across the Rockies, always chasing deadlines and headlights. But those days were behind him. Now his company was the creak of old wood, the crackle of the wood stove, and the gentle presence of Shadow, his aging but spirited Mustang, a living memory of wild country and years long gone. That night, Martin sat at his kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, the radio crackling weather updates as the blizzard howled outside. He could feel the storm in his bones, in the way his joints stiffened and his thoughts slowed to match the white, relentless hush. Shadow, gray-muzzled but still proud, stood at the window, watching the flakes stack up on the world. The phone never rang after sundown. Everyone in Pine Ridge knew that Martin kept to himself, especially in weather like this. But suddenly, it did ring, shrill and insistent, cutting through the quiet. Martin's hand hovered before he picked up, heart racing, a trace of old dread in his veins. Voices calling late at night were rarely good news. On the other end, a woman's voice, tense but trying to remain steady, introduced herself as Dr. Helen Mason, director at the Pine Ridge Children's Hospital. Her words tumbled out. The hospital's only generator had failed. The storm had knocked out power, plunging the pediatric wing into darkness. Several children, fighting for their lives on ventilators and monitors, were now at the mercy of the cold. Martin set his coffee down, knuckles white. "Surely the county'll send a plow in the morning. There's no time, Mr. Carter. The state troopers can't get through. We've tried snowmobiles, but the drifts are too deep. We need help tonight. There's a portable generator at Laramie's Supply. He's got it ready. But we can't get it here. You're the only one with a sleigh team left in Pine Ridge. Please. Those kids don't have till morning." For a moment, Martin heard nothing but his own pulse and the distant wind rattling the eaves. The idea of going out in this storm, at his age with only Shadow, sounded reckless, if not impossible. He thought of the night his wife, Ruth, had died in another storm, a memory that clung like a shadow to the edges of every winter. But as Dr. Mason spoke again, her voice cracking, Martin pictured the hospital, a squat, brick building already fighting to stay warm, and the children inside, scared, sick, depending on the kindness of strangers. He glanced at Shadow, who had turned from the window as if sensing the urgency in the room, his ears pricked and eyes alert. Martin closed his eyes. A sense of purpose, old and familiar, stirred in his chest. For years he'd carried freight through worse than this. Now, for the first time, the load was hope itself. "All right, Dr. Mason, I'll do it. Tell Laramie I'm coming for the generator. Keep those kids warm. I'll get it there." She choked out a thank you, voice shaking. "God bless you, Mr. Carter." Martin hung up, adrenaline flooding old muscles with new determination. He moved quickly, pulling on layers of flannel and his thickest parka, hands surprisingly steady for a man his age. Outside, the world was reduced to swirling white. Snowdrifts reached the porch, wind knifing through every seam. Martin made his way to the barn, where Shadow stood waiting in his stall. He ran his hands along Shadow's strong neck, feeling the warmth beneath the winter coat. "Looks like we got one more run in us, partner," he murmured. The Mustang nudged him, breath steaming, as if in answer. Martin began the routine he'd learned as a boy, but with double the care. He checked every part of the sleigh, runners, shafts, harness, recalling every story he'd ever heard of men lost in blizzards because they'd forgotten a single buckle. Shadow stamped, eager and restless, as Martin loaded up the sleigh with blankets, a shovel, and a battered thermos of coffee. He double-checked the straps, knowing that on a night like this, even the smallest mistake could mean disaster. As Martin worked, the storm only grew. The wind howled, battering the barn doors, but Shadow stood calm, trusting in the man he'd followed through years of rough country. Martin fitted the horse with special winter horseshoes, the metal biting into the ice with each step. Before leaving, Martin scrawled a note for his neighbor, just in case. Then he paused at the barn's threshold. The house behind him glowed faintly with the last of the generator's power. Ahead, the world was nothing but white chaos. He hesitated only a moment, then set his jaw. There was no one else coming. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders, but didn't bow him. He took Shadow's reins and stepped out into the storm. Snow lashed his face, instantly numbing any exposed skin. The sleigh's runners shrieked against the packed drifts as Martin and Shadow turned toward Laramie's store. The faintest glow on Main Street barely visible through the swirling dark. The journey had begun. Two old souls, horse and man, pressing forward into the unknown, carrying the fragile thread of hope for a town's most vulnerable children. As the wind swallowed them, Pine Ridge faded behind. Martin's heart thudded with fear, yes, but also something fiercer. A stubborn faith that just maybe one last ride could still make all the difference. Laramie's General Supply was a beacon against the dark, its lights shining out across the snow-choked street as Martin and Shadow arrived. The storm had already swallowed most of Pine Ridge, but the old store clung on, warm inside, lanterns burning and windows frosting with the cold. Laramie himself, a gruff man with a heart as big as the Montana sky, met Martin at the door, already bundled in his own patched coat, generator ready by the entrance. He offered no false comfort, just a firm nod and a heavy pat on Martin's shoulder as they loaded the crate onto the back of the sleigh. Martin double-checked the straps around the generator, lashing it down so tightly his fingers ached. He stuffed extra blankets around it for insulation, thinking of the precious, fragile lives depending on this box of wires and gasoline. Around him, the wind howled and groaned, shaking the eaves of the store. Laramie pressed a thermos of hot soup into Martin's hands, insisting he take it, and then slipped him a battered flashlight and an extra pair of wool gloves. No words were needed. They both understood the risks. With the generator secure, Martin guided Shadow away from the warm light of the store and into the swirling night. The rest of Pine Ridge was dark, windows shuttered, doors locked tight against the storm. Yet, as Martin and Shadow made their way through the heart of the town, shapes emerged from the snow, neighbors, friends, even old rivals, all drawn to the road by word of what Martin was attempting. Some offered quick words of encouragement, muffled by scarves and hoods, while others simply raised gloved hands in silent salute. No one tried to stop him. They all understood the stakes. Martin paused at the edge of town, looking back at the faint lights receding into darkness. He drew a deep breath, the air sharp as knives in his lungs, and glanced at Shadow. The Mustang's ears flicked forward, eyes bright and focused. Martin reached up, running a hand along the familiar line of Shadow's neck, feeling the warmth and strength beneath his winter coat. They'd been through hard country before, the two of them. Runaway cattle, washed-out trails, moonlit rides through the hills. But nothing like this. He remembered nights years ago, riding late across the prairie with Ruth, her laughter ringing through the darkness, her hands warm in his. Those days were gone, swept away by time and loss. But tonight, he carried her memory with him, tucked between every heartbeat, driving him forward. He wondered if she would be proud, if she'd approve of this last, reckless act of courage. Martin checked the sleigh once more, feeling every buckle and strap. He inspected the harness, tightened the cinches, and finally fit Shadow with special winter horseshoes, each one designed to grip the slickest ice and deepest snow. The old horse shifted his weight, snorting softly, as if eager for the challenge ahead. Martin brushed snow from Shadow's face, murmuring encouragement, and pressed his forehead briefly against the horse's. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Martin glanced at the sky. No stars, just roiling gray and white. The night seemed endless, the world reduced to a narrow corridor of possibility carved through the drifts. He looked once more at the dark shapes gathered at the edge of town, at the anxious faces peering from behind curtains and doors. "Don't wait up," he called over his shoulder, voice muffled but steady. And then, without hesitation, he turned Shadow toward the open road. The silence of the snowy night pressed in, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves and the low scrape of the sleigh's runners. Each step forward was a defiance, a promise that, even against the worst the world could throw, he would not turn back. As they left the last houses behind, Martin felt the weight of every eye upon him, every hope riding on the narrow runners of his battered sleigh. He could almost hear the prayers whispered behind closed doors, see the candles flickering in the hospital windows miles away. He tightened his grip on the reins, feeling Shadow's power surge beneath him. Hours passed as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the world shrinking to the circle of light cast by Martin's flashlight and the pale glow of drifting snow. Trees loomed up, branches heavy with ice, creaking in the gale. The sleigh shuddered over hidden ruts and frozen puddles, each jolt sending shivers through Martin's bones. He kept his focus on the trail ahead, trusting his memory and Shadow's instincts. Several times Martin paused to check the harness, clearing ice from the buckles and snow from the generator. Each stop was a risk. The cold ate into his bones, and the darkness pressed closer, thick and hungry. But Martin moved with the steady patience of a man who'd seen worse and survived. He was careful, methodical, every action guided by habit and the sharp edge of necessity. Occasionally, Shadow would turn his head, nostrils flaring, as if sensing something beyond the reach of human sight. Each time Martin would whisper to him, a quiet reassurance shared between old friends. They pressed on, mile after mile, leaving behind the warmth of home for the unforgiving embrace of the storm. With every step, Martin felt the stakes rise. This was no longer just a delivery, no longer just an errand for the hospital. It was a race against the elements, against time itself. Every child waiting in that darkened wing, every worried parent, every nurse fighting to keep hope alive. Martin carried them all with him, their lives bundled in the precious cargo strapped to his sleigh. Night deepened. The blizzard raged. But Martin and Shadow pressed forward, two stubborn hearts refusing to yield. At the edge of the world, with nothing but courage and memory to light the way, they vanished into the white, forging the first steps of a journey that would test every limit they'd ever known. The storm thickened with every passing hour, swallowing the last traces of Pine Ridge as Martin and Shadow pressed onward into the mountain wilds. Darkness wrapped itself around the world, smothering any familiar landmark beneath an endless shroud of drifting white. The sleigh's runners hissed and squealed over the hard-packed snow, and Martin hunched lower against the wind, each gust biting through his coat like sharpened ice. Martin could no longer see the road ahead. He had to trust in memory and instinct, replaying the map of these foothills in his mind. Over the years, he had learned every bend and hollow, every tree that marked the edge of a drop-off or the beginning of a climb. But tonight, the land itself seemed to shift beneath his feet, hiding dangers behind the curtain of swirling flakes. The wind shrieked through the pines, and the sky pressed down in a heavy, suffocating weight. Even Shadow's steady form seemed smaller, less certain in the storm's relentless assault. As they ventured deeper, the challenges mounted. A massive drift, nearly chest-high on Martin, blocked the trail within the first mile beyond the last farmstead. He climbed from the sleigh, legs burning with cold and effort, and began to dig with his battered shovel, tossing shovelful after shovelful of snow aside. His breath smoked in the air, hands numb inside his gloves, but he did not slow. Shadow stood perfectly still, head lowered, eyes watchful, as if guarding Martin from the dark. Finally, the sleigh broke through, lurching forward as Martin clambered aboard. But there was little time to catch his breath. The world had become an obstacle course of fallen branches, ice-choked ditches, and sudden walls of snow. More than once, Martin had to leap down, boots crunching through crusted drifts, to clear a path by hand or pull at half-buried branches that threatened to snag the sleigh. Each pause let the cold burrow deeper, numbing his fingers, making every task an act of stubborn will. Shadow's strength was their salvation. The old Mustang moved with surprising power, chest surging as he pulled the sleigh over frozen ruts, hooves biting through the ice. At every challenge, Shadow responded not with fear, but a calm resolve that lifted Martin's spirits, urging him onward. There were moments when the sleigh's load shifted, or the runners skidded dangerously close to the edge of a slope, when Martin felt doubt gnaw at his resolve. But each time Shadow steadied, finding secure footing even where Martin saw only peril. Visibility shrank to almost nothing. The flashlight beam, which had seemed so bright in the barn, now barely reached 10 yards ahead, dissolving into a fog of swirling white. Martin relied on Shadow's instincts as much as his own memory. When the wind howled so fiercely, it threatened to knock them from the trail. Shadow seemed to know where the path should run, veering with gentle nudges, ears flicking at every unseen obstacle. Time lost all meaning. There were only the endless repetitions: dig, haul, push, urge Shadow forward, and hope that each step brought them closer to the distant hospital and the children waiting in the dark. Martin's arms ached, and fatigue seeped into his bones. Every few miles he forced himself to stop and check the generator, clearing ice from the casing, making sure it was still lashed tightly to the sleigh. The snow had a way of working itself into every crack and seam, threatening to freeze moving parts and trap them far from help. At one point, Martin stumbled while clearing a drift, falling hard on his side. For a terrifying moment, the wind howled and the world spun white and dizzy around him. He lay in the snow, chest heaving, the cold seeping through his coat. Shadow, sensing something wrong, turned back, nostrils flaring, and nuzzled Martin's shoulder until he found the strength to rise again. He took a shuddering breath, pressed a trembling hand to Shadow's neck, and clambered back aboard. There was no room for weakness tonight. The deeper they traveled into the mountains, the more treacherous the trail became. Once a frozen stream blocked the way, the ice hidden beneath a skin of powder. Martin tested the surface, heart pounding, and then led Shadow carefully across, step by painstaking step. The ice groaned beneath the sleigh, but Shadow's sure-footedness kept them safe, muscles working hard to avoid a misstep that could end their journey and their lives in an instant. Night pressed even closer. The wind drove pellets of ice against Martin's face, stealing heat and hope with every gust. Still, he pressed on, refusing to let exhaustion win. Shadow's breath steamed in great clouds, and each time Martin's strength threatened to fail, he found renewed courage in the unwavering rhythm of the horse's stride. Every so often, Martin thought of the children waiting in the hospital, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight, nurses and doctors working frantically against time and cold. He imagined their parents, pacing the halls, watching the storm through frosted windows, praying for a miracle. It was for them he fought his way forward, through agony and cold, each step a promise he would not break. By the time they reached the halfway point, a battered sign nearly buried in snow, Martin could barely feel his hands. The generator's shape was an icy lump on the sleigh, and Shadow's muzzle was crusted with frost. But they pressed on, refusing to surrender to the blizzard's might. They had become a small island of warmth and hope against the storm's relentless sea, a partnership forged by hardship and necessity. And as the night deepened, Martin understood. Whatever lay ahead, he and Shadow would meet it together, one step at a time, until the children of Pine Ridge were safe or the storm itself gave out. As midnight neared, the storm showed no mercy, battering man and beast alike. Martin's face burned with cold, and his hands felt clumsy, but his mind remained sharp, fueled by determination and a flickering hope. After what felt like endless miles battling wind and snow, a small cluster of outbuildings appeared at the edge of the trees. An old mountain outpost, half buried in drifts, but a welcome break in the hostile white. Martin guided Shadow into the lee of the biggest shed, grateful for even a little shelter. The outpost had once served as a ranger station. Now it was nothing but warped boards and rusty hinges, but it offered a moment's reprieve. The wind howled past, pelting the walls with icy sleet as Martin set the brake on the sleigh and pulled out a worn blanket, draping it over Shadow's steaming back. He forced his fingers to move, brushing snow from the generator and checking the straps that held it fast. Each movement was deliberate and slow. He knew well enough that mistakes happened when a man let himself rush. Tonight, a single misstep could cost lives, his own and those depending on him. Inside the small shed, Martin found a battered oil lamp and a box of matches sealed in a jar. He coaxed the lamp to life, its feeble glow barely denting the gloom. He poured hot soup from the thermos into a tin cup, letting the warmth chase some of the cold from his bones. Through the gaps in the wall, he could see Shadow shifting his weight, shaking the ice from his mane, ever watchful despite his fatigue. What Martin did not see, hidden by swirling snow and deeper shadows, was another figure moving silently between the outbuildings. Ethan Briggs, an old rival, bitter and cunning, had tracked Martin through the storm. Years of envy and grudge had brought Ethan here, drawn by the chance to see Martin fail, to prove that the old man was past his prime. He watched, waiting, eyes narrowed with malice as Martin focused on the generator. When Martin ducked inside to catch his breath and refill his thermos, Ethan crept forward. His movements were practiced, quiet, full of purpose, He slipped a sharp hunting knife from his coat and crouched by the sleigh, fingers numb but sure as he began slicing at the key straps of the harness. He worked quickly, careful not to sever them completely. A clean break would be too obvious. Instead, he left the straps hanging by a thread, hidden from casual glance but certain to snap under stress. His work done, Ethan retreated into the dark, footsteps erased by fresh snow. He melted into the trees, unseen, convinced that Martin would never finish his mission. Satisfied, he waited to watch the disaster unfold. Unaware of the danger, Martin took a final sip of soup and wiped his mouth, the tin trembling in his grip. Weariness tugged at his eyelids, but he pushed it aside. He was almost halfway there, and the worst of the pass still lay ahead. He stepped out into the night, lamp in hand, and checked Shadow, rubbing warmth back into the horse's legs. Shadow snorted and stamped, restless in the storm. As Martin prepared to climb back onto the sleigh, Shadow suddenly froze, ears pricked and nostrils flaring. The Mustang stamped hard, then tossed his head, refusing to step forward when Martin urged him. Martin frowned, feeling a spike of anxiety pierce his exhaustion. Shadow had always been level-headed, never balking at trail hazards or wild weather. Martin circled to the harness, running his hands along each strap and buckle. There. His fingers found the frayed leather, nearly sliced through, just a tug away from breaking. His heart hammered in his chest as the truth dawned. This was no accident. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate. Someone had tried to sabotage the mission, to endanger not just Martin, but Shadow and the precious cargo they carried. Rage and fear surged through him, pushing aside fatigue. He imagined the harness snapping on a mountain trail, the sleigh tumbling, Shadow trapped or worse, the generator lost. The children in the hospital flashed before his eyes. For a moment, the enormity of the danger threatened to overwhelm him, but Martin's years on the road had taught him to meet crisis with action, not panic. He rummaged through his repair kit, fingers shaking as he stitched and reinforced the damaged straps. Every minute spent repairing was a minute lost to the storm and to the ticking clock at the hospital. But there was no choice. His breath steamed in the cold as he worked, the needle awkward in his numb hands. But he pressed on, patching the harness as best he could. All the while, Shadow remained perfectly still, muscles tense, eyes alert. The horse had sensed the danger before Martin had, a reminder of the deep trust and bond between them. When the repairs were finally finished, Martin patted Shadow's flank, silent gratitude flowing between them. Before setting off again, Martin scanned the shadows around the outpost, a hard edge settling into his mind. Someone wanted him to fail. But as he guided Shadow and the sleigh back into the blizzard, Martin felt his resolve harden to steel. He would not let sabotage or storm stop him. The mission had become more than a delivery. It was a test of his courage and of Shadow's loyalty. And so into the storm they rode, battered but unbroken, hearts burning with purpose as the mountain loomed ahead. The mountain loomed ahead, its flanks swallowed by darkness and the wild sweep of the storm. Martin could barely make out the shape of the trail, now nothing more than a ribbon of uncertainty carved into the rock and ice. The repaired harness tugged at his nerves. He checked it twice more before pushing forward, trusting the work of his trembling hands and the keen alertness of Shadow. Devil's Pass was notorious in these parts, a name spoken in wary tones even in summer. In winter, with the world buried under snow and the cliffs glazed in ice, it was the kind of place most folks crossed only in stories or nightmares. The pass was a narrow ledge hewn from the mountain's face, falling away to dizzying depths on one side and rising steep and sheer on the other. Tonight, the wind turned the trail into a tunnel of shrieking cold, the snow blasting sideways, biting at flesh and bone. Martin felt every year of his age in his hands and legs, but he set his jaw and kept going. He whispered thanks to Shadow under his breath. Each step the Mustang took steady and sure, hooves clattering against stone, sparks sometimes flashing where metal bit into the ice. The generator rattled in the sleigh, its weight both a burden and a lifeline, reminding Martin why he could not fail. They moved as one, man and horse, senses sharpened by fear and necessity. Martin could feel Shadow's tension through the reins, every muscle taut with concentration. The edge of the trail was invisible beneath the drifts. Only the faint memory of the land kept them from slipping into nothingness. Sometimes the wind roared so hard that Martin thought he heard voices in it, ghosts of others who had tried this route and never returned. He fought to keep his mind clear, counting each step, focusing on what was real: Shadow's breath, the creak of the harness, the sting of snow on his cheeks. Partway along the pass, the night exploded with new peril. Up ahead, just visible in the swirling snow, a figure on horseback materialized from the white. For a moment, Martin's heart stopped. Then he recognized Ethan Briggs, his old rival, now little more than a silhouette outlined in the gloom, but unmistakable all the same. Ethan's presence was a shock, but there was no mistaking the intent in the way he blocked the trail. The man shouted something Martin couldn't hear over the wind, but the tone was unmistakable. Threat, anger, the desperate pride of a man determined to see another fail. Ethan began to pelt the trail ahead with snowballs and rocks, sending them tumbling down the slope, trying to spook Shadow or block the way. Shadow skidded to a halt, eyes wild and ears flat, but Martin soothed him with a hand and a few steady words, grateful again for the horse's iron heart. Ethan's horse danced nervously on the icy ledge, uncertain, as its rider hurled another rock that bounced dangerously close to the sleigh. Martin ducked instinctively, heart racing. The path ahead was a gauntlet now, narrow, icy, and under attack from a man driven by spite. Martin knew he had no time to waste. Every moment lost to Ethan's games was a moment stolen from the children waiting in the hospital, their lives hanging in the balance. He searched for a way through, eyes scanning the edge of the pass for anything: a wider spot, a break in the rocks, a chance to push forward. The wind screamed, driving sheets of snow into his face, but Martin pressed on, voice calm but urgent as he urged Shadow forward. The Mustang responded with courage, picking his way past the scattered debris, head low against the gale. Martin felt the sleigh lurch and tip as a rock struck one runner, but Shadow steadied it, muscle and instinct keeping them upright on the edge. Ethan's shouts became more frenzied, his movements wilder. He hurled a heavy branch, but it landed short, cracking on the ice. His own horse balked, nearly slipping, and Ethan cursed, trying to force it forward. But even the fiercest men could not master a mountain storm. Martin saw the first flickers of doubt in Ethan's posture as the wind threatened to tear him from his saddle. For Martin, there was only the next step, and the next. He kept his gaze on the far side of the pass, every muscle tense, each heartbeat pounding in his ears. Shadow's breath steamed in the darkness, and Martin felt the bond between them. Two survivors, stubborn and unbroken, defying not just the elements, but those who wished them to fail. As they cleared the worst of Ethan's makeshift blockade, Martin glanced back, locking eyes with his rival through the storm. There was no triumph in Martin's stare, only a warning. He would not be stopped. Not tonight. He pressed on, heart pounding, the edge of the mountain falling away behind him as shadow carried them forward. They had passed the first gauntlet, but the night was far from over. Devil's Pass had lived up to its name, and Martin knew the dangers ahead would only grow sharper. Yet in the storm, beneath the weight of sabotage and old grudges, hope still glimmered, a fragile light moving through the darkness, refusing to die. They were barely through the narrowest bend of Devil's Pass when the storm seemed to reach a new, furious peak. Snow whipped sideways, stinging Martin's cheeks and swirling so thickly that he could hardly tell earth from sky. The path beneath the sleigh was more suggestion than certainty, a razor's edge of ice perched above the abyss. Shadow's hooves found their footing by some ancient animal instinct, never faltering even when the sleigh skidded treacherously close to the drop. Martin was just easing his breath, thinking they might have made it, when Ethan reappeared. This time closer, blocking the trail so completely that even the wind seemed to pause. His silhouette, tall and rigid on horseback, cut through the blizzard like a threat made solid. In the howling dark, Ethan's voice reached Martin as a ragged snarl, words lost but intent clear. There would be no more warning shots, no more games. This was a challenge at the edge of the world. Ethan drove his own horse forward, pinning Martin and Shadow against the cliff. The ledge was so narrow here that the sleigh's outer runner scraped stone, and the chasm below yawned wider than ever. Ethan's eyes gleamed with a bitter light. He had the desperate energy of a man with nothing left to lose. Maybe it was revenge for old wounds, or perhaps he simply wanted to prove that Martin could be bested, even on his last ride. Martin acted on instinct, every sense sharpened by fear and fatigue. He gripped the pole at the front of his sleigh, the long wooden shaft used for prodding snow or clearing debris. When Ethan tried to crowd Shadow back, Martin used the pole to shove away fallen branches and icy clumps that Ethan had thrown to block the way. Ethan pressed closer, trying to spook Shadow with wild gestures, even swinging his own reins dangerously near the Mustang's eyes. Shadow stood his ground, muscles bunching under his winter coat, breath snorting in clouds of steam. Martin murmured a few steady words, but mostly he trusted the horse's courage. Shadow's wild blood had seen him through worse. When Ethan's horse shied sideways, nearly knocking into Shadow, Martin's sleigh shuddered. For one heart-stopping instant, the entire world tipped, runners biting against ice, the generator threatening to slide free, the abyss below ready to swallow them all. Time seemed to stretch as Ethan pressed his attack. Rocks and snowballs pelted the sleigh, some bouncing harmlessly off the wood, others ricocheting perilously close to Martin's head. Ethan even tried to reach out, grabbing at the reins, but Martin was quicker, using the sleigh pole to jab the snow between them, forcing Ethan to pull back just enough. It was Shadow who found the answer. With a sudden, powerful kick, the Mustang struck a pile of loose rocks near the edge of the trail. The stones tumbled down the slope in a miniature avalanche, striking Ethan's horse squarely in the hindquarters. Spooked, the animal bolted sideways, nearly toppling Ethan from the saddle and scattering more rocks and branches down the cliff. Ethan's horse whinnied, spinning in place, and for a moment all chaos broke loose. Martin seized the opportunity. With the path momentarily clear, he shouted and drove Shadow forward, urging the sleigh past Ethan's tangled horse. Shadow surged, hooves scrambling for grip, runners shrieking as they shot across the slickest patch of the pass. The generator rocked, but Martin's careful lashing held. He ducked his head, eyes streaming from the cold, forcing himself not to look at the dizzying void just inches away. Ethan shouted curses, trying to regain control, but he was left behind in the storm, forced to fight both his terrified horse and the mountain's fury. For Martin, there was no time to celebrate. He risked a quick glance back. Ethan was shaken, but not beaten, clinging to his horse, eyes wild with rage and frustration. Breath heaving, Martin pressed on, feeling every ounce of strain in his legs and back. The danger of the pass had not abated, but he and Shadow had survived the standoff, by quick thinking, by trust, and by a bond that ran deeper than words. Shadow, for his part, tossed his head and powered forward, the fire of adrenaline lending him new strength. Each step away from the ledge was a small victory, a testament to the Mustang's unbreakable spirit. But the storm was not finished with them. As they moved beyond the worst of Devil's Pass, the wind picked up again, now hurling needles of ice against their faces. The trail sloped downward, but twisted through narrow gullies and overhung by menacing trees, each branch groaning beneath its icy burden. Martin's muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to focus, steering the sleigh around obstacles, always aware that Ethan might return at any moment. Yet for now, the greatest danger had passed. Martin's heart beat in his chest like a war drum, part fear, part exhilaration, part stubborn pride. He had faced down a rival, survived a deadly trap, and pushed one step closer to the hospital and the waiting children. Shadow's coat was slick with sweat beneath the frost, his breath fogging the air, but he carried on, undaunted. Together, they pressed forward, deeper into the night, two souls battered but undefeated, their courage shining like a beacon in the storm. Whatever lay ahead, Martin knew now that nothing, not sabotage, not rivalry, not even the mountain's fury, would break their resolve. The hardest miles were yet to come, but they had earned the right to hope. The worst of Devil's Pass faded behind them, but the descent promised no mercy. Martin felt the muscles in his arms and legs tremble from strain, every inch of him battered by cold and fatigue. Shadow's breaths came in sharp, frosty bursts, nostrils flaring as he steadied his stride for the journey down the steepest part of the mountain. The wind still howled, and the world remained a swirl of stinging white. But the trail sloped away now, twisting downward into even deeper darkness. With every turn, the sleigh groaned under the weight of the generator and the punishing cold. Each rut and icy dip threatened to send it lurching sideways, testing Martin's grip and Shadow's footing. He kept his body low and his eyes locked on the narrow trail, focusing on each next step, trying not to let his mind wander to what would happen if the sleigh tipped or the generator slipped free. The slope sharpened, and at one harrowing bend, the runners hit a patch of hidden ice. The world seemed to tilt beneath them. The sleigh skidded sideways, Shadow straining against the harness as Martin braced himself with every ounce of strength he had left. For a moment, the sleigh hung at an impossible angle, the heavy generator sliding in its bindings, threatening to spill into the snow and drag everything after it. Martin's heart hammered as he lunged, shoving his shoulder against the crate, straining to keep it from toppling over the side. Shadow sensed the danger, fighting for balance, hooves scraping for purchase. Somehow, the Mustang found his footing, muscles rippling as he pulled the sleigh back from the edge of disaster. Martin let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. There was no time for relief. The path kept dropping, twisting sharply, flanked by rocky outcrops that loomed like sentinels in the storm. The air grew colder as they descended, the snow deepening with each turn. Martin's fingers grew numb, and his beard was stiff with frost, but he forced himself to check the generator after each near mishap. The bindings held. The old man's hands shook as he worked, but he refused to cut corners. Each inspection, each adjustment, was another shield against the disaster that stalked them at every turn. At one point, the wind let up for a brief, breathless moment. Martin paused, letting Shadow rest, both of them shrouded in an eerie silence. The woods around them were heavy with snow, branches drooping low over the trail. Martin could feel exhaustion clawing at the edges of his awareness. He thought about the children waiting at the hospital, each heartbeat counting down the hours of their hope. That thought, more than fear, more than pain, kept him moving. The break didn't last. The storm surged again, and visibility shrank to almost nothing. Martin wrapped a scarf tighter around his face and guided Shadow forward. At a narrow bridge crossing a half-frozen creek, disaster struck again. The sleigh's runner caught on a buried stone, jolting Martin sideways. He lost his footing, his boots slipping on the slick planks. For a heartbeat, he dangled at the edge, the void beneath the bridge yawning up at him. Shadow, sensing Martin's panic, turned back, muscles bunching as he braced himself and pulled against the harness. The sleigh shifted just enough for Martin to grab hold and haul himself up, chest heaving, snow caked in his beard and lashes. He pressed his forehead to Shadow's neck, drawing strength from the Mustang's steady heartbeat. The moment passed, but the memory of it clung to Martin, a reminder of how quickly luck could change in the mountains. They pressed on, the partnership between man and horse deepening with every challenge. Where Martin's body began to fail, Shadow's wild spirit took over. The Mustang moved with a surety born from years of hard living, his instincts guiding them around hidden pitfalls and along invisible trails. Martin leaned into that trust, surrendering his fear to the rhythm of Shadow's stride, focusing only on the forward motion that kept hope alive. The miles wore on. The storm's fury ebbed and flowed, and the world outside the circle of Martin's lamp was nothing but shifting gray. Yet, within that narrow bubble, something unbreakable grew between Martin and Shadow. A silent conversation carried in every glance, every tug of the reins, every heartbeat. They became more than just a man and a horse. They were a team, bound by desperation, grit, and a promise to those children waiting in the dark. When they finally reached the bottom of the mountain, Martin felt a shudder of relief, tempered by the knowledge that the journey was not yet done. The land leveled out, and the snow grew deeper but less treacherous. Martin checked the generator one more time, his movements slow but sure, then turned Shadow toward the final stretch. The lights of Pine Ridge were still a distant dream, but with every step, they were closer. Martin straightened his back and patted Shadow's neck. For all the storm had thrown at them, they had survived. Each moment of terror had forged them stronger, and the bond between them now felt unbreakable. With grit in their hearts and the memory of every narrow escape burning behind their eyes, they pushed forward, ready for whatever new trials dawn would bring. Dawn was only a rumor on the horizon when Martin and Shadow reached the low country beyond the mountain's grip. The world here was softer, but no less unforgiving, blanketed by knee-deep drifts that sapped strength from every step. Martin's body ached with exhaustion, each joint stiff from cold and the long battle through the pass, but he refused to let the weariness win. The generator rattled on the sleigh, a constant reminder of the lives depending on its delivery. The wind shifted as they approached the outskirts of Pine Ridge, carrying with it the distant cry of a town slowly waking to hope and worry. The sky was still heavy with snow, but the dark began to crack and fade as morning crept closer. Martin dared to believe that, after all the trials and near misses, the hardest part was behind them. He was wrong. The last stretch of the journey followed a winding lane, crossing a rickety wooden bridge that spanned a narrow, icy creek, the only direct route into town. Martin's thoughts raced ahead. He pictured the hospital's cold halls, nurses peering out frosted windows, children bundled in blankets, waiting for a miracle. With each clop of Shadow's hooves, those images grew sharper, the weight of responsibility both a burden and a fuel that burned away his doubt. Then, out of the blowing snow at the far end of the bridge, a figure appeared. Even before Martin saw the face, he knew it was Ethan, persistent, desperate, and unyielding as the storm itself. Ethan blocked the way, his shape hunched against the wind, eyes wild with fury and pride stoked to a breaking point. He looked ragged, the night's ordeal written in every twitch of his face and tremor in his hands. Martin's heart sank. There was no path around. The banks of the creek rose steep and treacherous on either side, the water below half choked with ice. Ethan had chosen his ground well. He stood by the edge of the bridge, a crowbar clutched in his hand. The clear threat that he would destroy the generator, the sleigh, or both if Martin tried to pass. For a moment, the world seemed to hang in silence, the only sound the ragged breathing of man and horse, and the creaking of ice shifting beneath the bridge. Martin felt the weight of every hour he'd spent battling storm and sabotage, every hope and prayer that had carried him this far. To be stopped now, so close, was almost unthinkable. Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse, demanding Martin turn back, daring him to try and force a way through. His desperation was naked, edged with the bitterness of old wounds and fresh failure. Martin recognized in Ethan the same stubbornness that kept him moving forward, a refusal to be bested, no matter the cost. But here, that stubbornness had curdled into something cruel. Martin gripped the reins, steadying his shaking hands. Shadow pawed at the ground, sensing the tension and danger, nostrils flaring. The Mustang's eyes were sharp and alive, no fear in their depths, only the same relentless resolve that had carried them over the mountain. Time slowed as Martin weighed his options. There was no safe path, no way to negotiate or plead. The only way forward was through. Ethan stepped forward, swinging the crowbar menacingly, determined to make good on his threat. Martin's mind raced, seeking a solution that would avoid disaster. But before he could act, Shadow responded to the challenge. With a sudden, explosive motion, the Mustang surged forward, muscles bunching beneath his winter coat. Martin held on tight as Shadow charged straight at Ethan, who hesitated, startled by the raw power and will of the horse. Ethan stumbled backward, his nerve faltering at the last second. Shadow barreled onto the bridge, snow and ice spraying beneath his hooves. Martin leaning into the momentum, every part of him focused on protecting the precious generator. Ethan made a last frantic attempt to stand his ground, but Shadow's advance left him no choice but to leap aside. The Mustang shouldered past, forcing Ethan off balance and into a bank of powdery snow at the bridge's edge. The crowbar slipped from Ethan's hand, clattering uselessly onto the frozen planks. For a breathless instant, the whole world seemed to tilt. Ethan sprawled in the snow, Shadow and Martin thundering across the bridge, the generator rattling but secure. On the far side, Martin risked a glance back. Ethan sat up slowly, snow-caked and defeated, his anger spent and his power broken. Martin didn't linger. There were still children waiting, still miles to go, and the first real light of morning breaking through the storm. Martin urged Shadow forward, the Mustang moving with renewed energy, as if sensing the end was near. The town was waking up now, faint lights flickering in windows, figures emerging in the distance, drawn by the sound of the sleigh and the hope it carried. Martin felt exhaustion fading beneath a surge of purpose. The worst was behind them. Together, he and Shadow had faced betrayal, storm, and rivalry, and emerged unbroken. The hospital's brick facade appeared at the end of the street, bathed in the soft glow of sunrise and the awe of those who had waited through the night. Martin set his jaw, tightened his grip, and pressed on, knowing that with every step they brought not just a generator, but a miracle to the children of Pine Ridge. The first rays of sunlight crept across Pine Ridge as Martin and Shadow reached the hospital gates, their forms silhouetted against the swirling remnants of the blizzard. The journey's final stretch felt both endless and far too short. Martin's body ached with every bump of the sleigh, his hands numb, eyes stinging from wind and exhaustion. Yet hope surged with every clop of Shadow's hooves. The journey, for all its dangers, had not been in vain. As they rounded the final corner, the hospital came into view, a sturdy red brick building dusted with fresh snow. Lights glowed in every window, flickering like beacons against the morning gray. A small crowd had gathered outside, bundled in parkas and scarves, their anxious faces pressed close to the entrance, searching the white horizon for any sign of rescue. Nurses and doctors, faces drawn and tired, stood with parents whose worry was etched deep by the sleepless night. A shout went up the moment Martin's sleigh appeared. The crowd surged forward, a mixture of disbelief and hope breaking into cheers that cut through the morning cold. Martin sat a little taller in the seat, pride warming his battered frame as the townsfolk rushed to meet them. Shadow, too, lifted his head higher, his stride gathering new life from the energy around them. In an instant, hands were everywhere, lifting the generator from the sleigh, checking the heavy bindings, voices overlapping in a confusion of orders and gratitude. Nurses thanked Martin with tears in their eyes as the staff wheeled the generator through the hospital doors, ready to breathe life back into the machines the children so desperately needed. Parents pressed forward, some crying openly, others simply clasping Martin's hands in silent, fervent thanks. The storm's fury was already fading from memory, replaced by a collective sense of awe at what had just been achieved. Martin could barely speak. He felt the ache of every mile in his bones, the strain of every close call. But beneath the exhaustion was a profound sense of relief, a pressure that finally lifted as he watched the generator disappear inside, accompanied by the urgency of nurses and the first sounds of life flickering back to the building. He slumped against the sleigh, eyes closing for just a moment as the world spun around him. Shadow was surrounded by a cluster of children and parents, small hands reaching out to stroke his snowy coat and offer him carrots and apples. The Mustang's dark eyes softened, nostrils quivering as he accepted the affection with quiet dignity. Word spread quickly through the crowd. It was Shadow, not just Martin, who had braved the worst of the storm, who had sensed danger at the outpost, stood firm on the icy ledge, and charged through the final gauntlet at the bridge. The townsfolk began to cheer not just for the old trucker, but for his loyal horse, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed down the snow-covered street. Inside the hospital, technicians worked feverishly to connect the generator, the hum of machinery slowly returning as lights flickered back on. Martin watched through the windows as doctors hurried to the children's ward, checking each tiny face, listening for the blessed sound of steady, mechanical breathing. Every nurse who passed through the doors offered Martin a grateful nod, their exhaustion now tempered by relief. Parents clung to one another, tears flowing freely at the sight of monitors lighting up, heaters buzzing to life, and hope restored to rooms that had been so close to despair. For a long time, Martin simply stood there, hands on Shadow's withers, his breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. He felt himself trembling with something that was not quite cold and not quite fear, a deep, unnameable gratitude for having survived, for having mattered in this moment when the stakes were everything. Shadow nudged him gently, the warm, familiar gesture grounding him in the present. The crowd refused to let Martin slip away unnoticed. They hoisted him up, not just with hands, but with stories and praise, calling him a hero, though he shook his head in protest. He tried to explain that it was Shadow who deserved the glory, that without the Mustang's instincts and courage, they'd never have made it past the outpost, the pass, or Ethan's last desperate attack. But the people of Pine Ridge knew the truth. It was the partnership, the unbreakable bond between man and horse, that had saved their children that night. A local reporter snapped photographs, the flash capturing Martin and Shadow standing side by side, snow clinging to their coats and hats. Someone draped a blanket over Martin's shoulders and offered him a steaming mug of coffee, the heat spreading through his frozen fingers as he sipped. For the first time since the phone call had shattered his peace, Martin allowed himself to relax, to truly feel the weight of what he and Shadow had accomplished. As the sun climbed higher, the sense of relief deepened. Parents brought their children outside, some still pale but smiling, waving shyly at the man and horse who had become their saviors. Doctors and nurses gathered for a group photograph, insisting that Martin and Shadow be at the center, a memory to be preserved, a testament to the power of grit, loyalty, and hope in the darkest of nights. The storm's legacy lingered, but in its wake Pine Ridge found something greater: unity, gratitude, and a story that would be retold for generations. How an old trucker and a Mustang conquered the blizzard and delivered a miracle when it was needed most. After the chaos of arrival faded, Pine Ridge found itself changed in ways no one could have foreseen. In the days that followed the blizzard, word of Martin and Shadow's journey traveled far beyond the town's snow-drifted streets. Newspapers picked up the story, a retired trucker and his Mustang braving a historic storm to save the town's most vulnerable. Reporters arrived with cameras and notepads, but to Martin, the real miracle was the feeling that had settled over the town, a quiet, shared gratitude, a deeper sense of connection that lingered long after the snow melted from the rooftops. Martin spent the first day recovering at the hospital, where doctors insisted he stay for observation. He tried to protest, but the exhaustion running through his bones left him no room to argue. Nurses brought him hot broth and warm blankets, and townsfolk came in a steady stream to thank him, some with firm handshakes, others with tearful hugs. He found it almost overwhelming, this sudden surge of attention, but Shadow's presence nearby, grazing on sweet hay, blanketed and admired by hospital staff and children alike, helped keep him grounded. When he was well enough to leave his room, Dr. Mason met him in the hospital's therapy barn, a new addition meant for children's rehabilitation. She explained her vision: therapy horses to help young patients heal, both physically and emotionally. The hospital, she said, could use someone with Martin's experience, not just to care for the horses, but to guide the children, to share the steady calm and practical wisdom he'd gained from a lifetime with animals. At first, Martin hesitated. For so long he had lived at the edge of things, a trucker on the road, a widower on the outskirts of town. He wondered what he could offer beyond the story of one wild night. But as he watched the children gather around Shadow, their hands gentle and eyes bright with wonder, something inside him softened. These kids, many still pale and uncertain, opened up around Shadow's quiet strength. Some had never touched a horse before, but soon were feeding him carrots, giggling as his whiskers tickled their palms. Martin realized it wasn't just his story that mattered. It was the example, the reassurance, the chance to witness how courage and kindness could overcome even the deepest winter. He accepted Dr. Mason's offer, and his days took on new rhythm. Each morning, Martin rose early to help with the horses, his joints aching less as purpose took the place of routine. He became a mentor for the children, teaching them to groom and ride, to listen for the soft language of animals. Even the shyest kids grew bold around Shadow, who had become a legend almost overnight. The Mustang wore his new fame lightly, responding with the same calm patience that had carried Martin through the blizzard. If anything, he seemed to thrive under the attention, ears flicking at every new sound, tail swishing as he accepted endless pats and treats. Shadow's reputation grew. The hospital named him their official mascot of hope, painting his likeness on a mural in the children's wing. Local artists depicted the journey in a series of colorful scenes, and families from nearby towns began to visit, hoping to meet the Mustang who had helped deliver a miracle. Shadow took it all in stride, sometimes napping in the sun, while a dozen children braided his mane, sometimes leading slow, careful laps around the barn for those still recovering their strength. Even Ethan Briggs's fate became a cautionary tale rather than a bitter memory. After the storm, searchers found Ethan huddled in a snowbank, weak but alive. The town didn't turn its back on him. Instead, they brought him to the hospital, where he was treated for frostbite and exhaustion. When his actions became known, there was anger, especially among those who'd nearly lost children. But there was also a measure of pity. Pine Ridge was too small, too closely knit, to let anger fester. Ethan faced consequences, community service, public apology, but he was given a chance to redeem himself, to find a better path forward. As weeks passed, the hospital's therapy program flourished. Martin found himself surrounded by new friends, children who clung to his stories and his steady voice, townsfolk who invited him for coffee and conversation. He discovered a satisfaction he hadn't known since his days on the open road, a sense of belonging, of being needed and seen. The bond between Martin and Shadow only deepened. Their story became the heart of Pine Ridge, a touchstone the town would return to each winter as the snow began to fall. Parents told their children about the night hope rode through the storm, how an old man and a wild Mustang proved that the coldest trials could forge the strongest bonds. On the anniversary of that journey, Pine Ridge held a celebration. The hospital staff, townsfolk, and families gathered around a bonfire, sharing hot drinks and memories. Martin and Shadow led a small parade down Main Street, children trailing behind, their laughter ringing out beneath the clear Montana sky. Martin looked out at his neighbors, his friends, and felt the world open wide again. No longer an outsider, but part of something larger, something lasting. As twilight settled over the snowy rooftops, Martin stood with Shadow at the edge of the crowd, hand resting on the Mustang's neck. He thought of all that had changed, how courage could inspire hope, how kindness could heal old wounds, how even a life marked by loss could find new meaning when shared with others. He knew the road ahead would bring its own storms, but for the first time in years, he looked forward to each new morning, grateful for the journey that had brought him home.